The next live-action Batman film, following the towering achievement of Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, would not serve as a standalone tale, but instead as a precursor to an expanded DC universe. Zack Snyder, the polarizing director known for his adaptations of legendary comic books Watchmen and 300, as well as for his remake of the George Romero zombie classic Dawn of the Dead, would be given the reins. His first foray into the DC Comics universe was with his film Man of Steel, which served as an origin story for Superman, recontextualizing him for a modern era. The film was met with mixed critical reception and hit a strong box office performance. This would allow Snyder to continue to realize his vision for a DC extended universe. Man of Steel was produced by Christopher Nolan, Emma Thomas, Deborah Snyder, and Charles Roven. It was based on a story by Nolan and David S. Goyer, with the screenplay written by Goyer. This creative team represented the transition for DC films from the Nolan era into the Snyder era. A follow-up to the successful first film would then need to set up a larger universe, as well as introduce the members of the Justice League. The film would have initial work on the screenplay done by David S. Goyer before scheduling conflicts led to him leaving the project. Chris Terrio, who won an Academy Award for his screenplay for Argo, was brought into the project. Christopher Nolan and Emma Thomas would not return as producers for the film. Instead, Deborah Snyder and Charles Roven would serve as the producers for the film. The film would have a slew of returning Snyder collaborators, with Larry Fong brought in as cinematographer. David Brenner would serve as editor, with Hans Zimmer and Junkie XL scoring the film. Patrick Tatopoulos would be brought in as production designer. Henry Cavill would return as Superman, along with the major players from Man of Steel. The major new casting choice would be Ben Affleck being brought in as Batman. The decision was met with backlash from the fans, which at this point has become a rite of passage for every actor who has taken on the role. Jesse Eisenberg would be cast as Lex Luthor, with Gal Gadot becoming the first Wonder Woman in a live-action film. The film would also need to fill out the rest of the cast for the Justice League to fill out several cameos throughout the film. Jason Momoa would become Aquaman, Ezra Miller would be the Flash, with Ray Fisher introduced as Cyborg, with Jeremy Irons filling out the main cast as Alfred Pennyworth. Snyder would bring a different approach to filmmaking than Nolan, with less of an obsession with practical effects and realism, instead relying on a mix of practical effects and CGI that would allow for him to create the type of grand and epic images he loved. His filmmaking style was informed by the comic books he loved and adapted. This would involve much more green screen, placing more of a burden on the acting to sell the action. The sets would be less elaborately detailed, with a different approach to world building being realized through the story's dense usage of socio-political commentary, philosophical and psychological themes, and mythic allusions. This density would be a complex puzzle for Chris Terrio to solve. Terrio and Snyder wanted to give a serious look at Batman and Superman, one that would give the characters the respect they felt they deserved. Terrio described the process of writing the screenplay to the Wall Street Journal. Quote, "This has been the most rigorous intellectual exercise I've had in my writing life. If you told me the most rigorous dramaturgical and intellectual product of my life would be superhero movies, I would say you were crazy. But I do think fans deserve that. I felt I owed the fan base all of my body and soul for 2 years, because anything less wouldn't have been appreciating the opportunity I had." End quote. Zack Snyder felt that at its core, the film was about Batman refinding his humanity. To accomplish that, the film would have to introduce a Batman who had lost his way. They would feature a Batman who was operating long before Superman ever showed up, tying the ending of the previous film into the opening for this film, showing the consequences of the choices made by superheroes, which was a major motivating factor for the story that the film tells. It would be a dense film that attempted to showcase what would happen if these mythic characters were real and in our world. This would inform a number of the choices that were made with the narrative. One of the major ways the film showcases this thematic element is in the opening with the recontextualized view of the finale of Man of Steel. Through the eyes of Bruce Wayne, the fight between General Zod and Superman is viewed as a 9/11 style event. Bruce becomes radicalized as a result, willing to go to any means necessary to kill Superman. his speech to Alfred as to why he views Superman as an enemy uses the concept of the 1% doctrine that Dick Cheney used during the War on Terror. He even quotes Cheney with a line that was revealed in Ron Susskind's book, The 1% Doctrine. Quote, "If there's a 1% chance that Pakistani scientists are helping Al-Qaeda build or develop a nuclear weapon, we have to treat it as a certainty in terms of our response. It's not about our analysis, it's about our response." End quote.
We believe there's even a 1% chance that he is our enemy. We have to take it as an absolute certainty. And we have to destroy him.
Snyder also took inspiration from one of his deep fascinations, Joseph Campbell's theories of the monomyth, or the hero's journey. Snyder took so much inspiration that Campbell's own words were inscribed into the production design itself.
Kryptonian script that is incorporated into the chainmail pattern. And what it is, it's a Joseph Campbell quote that Zach really liked in relation to Superman. It's a beautiful quote that ends with, "Where we had thought to be alone, we will be with all the world."
Once used by George Lucas as a template for Star Wars, Snyder would incorporate elements of the monomyth to explore what he viewed as our modern mythology, superheroes, using the two most popular heroes to deconstruct the very idea of superheroes in a way that would expose how they would fit alongside our modern society. He wanted to show how despite Superman's pure intentions, none of what he does can be wholly good, and that there would always be unintended consequences.
No such thing as just purely being good all the time. We really wanted to start to talk about what the reality of just saving people and sort of intervening would mean. Like, the classic idea with Superman is that he wouldn't do anything too political, but in truth, it's impossible in the world not to. It's a political world. Everything we do is political.
He wanted to explore how we would treat Superman as a political problem. Superman's recontextualization in Man of Steel as an embodiment of the outsider or the immigrant would put an interesting perspective on Batman's radicalization against him. This problematizing of the inherent structure of a superhero film would be at dramatic odds with the way the film would be promoted to the general public. Starting with the title, Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, which would serve multiple purposes, both as a way of creating a WWE-style marketing angle with the two most iconic superheroes being pitted against each other, as well as a way of promoting the expanded world concept of the Justice League that they would be introducing in this film. This was a compromise for Snyder, who got them to shorten verses to a simple V. The title brings to mind crossover films like Alien vs. Predator or Freddy vs. Jason, films that were big box office hits but weren't necessarily tied to any of the pre-existing franchises' timelines. It would reduce the film to a simple marketing ploy rather than reflecting the artistic intent of the film. Of course, these types of compromises between artistry and business are inherent to the film industry, a necessary evil. However, I think that in this case, the title and the aggressive marketing campaign misled the audience and primed them to dislike the film. Another major artistic compromise that the film had to make before its theatrical release was the cutting of around 30 minutes from the film, with the theatrical cut running 152 minutes. This trimming down of the film hurt the film's coherence and linear narrative, making the film more of a series of vignettes featuring these characters with a fuzzier overarching narrative structure. The theatrical cut was criticized by Chris Terrio, who accused the studios of sabotaging the film in an interview with Vanity Fair. Quote, "If you took 30 minutes out of Argo as they were from Batman Superman, it would make zero sense at all. Critics would say, what a lazy screenplay, because the characters don't have motivations and it's not coherent. And I would agree with them." End quote. After these compromises and delays to hone the final theatrical cut, the film would be released on March 25, 2016. The film made over $870 million worldwide on a reported $250 million budget. This would be a disappointment for the studio, with the film's dramatic weekend drops preventing it from reaching its lofty aspirations. The critical reception was very negative. Critic Bilge Ebiri in The Village Voice criticized the film's attempts at philosophical depth. Quote, "The film seems to spend much of its first half in both literal and figurative slow motion, as characters mutter and mull and ponder these issues, often in the least compelling ways." End quote. Fan reception was mixed, with many fans taking issue with the way their favorite heroes were portrayed in the film. Zack Snyder eventually responded to these criticisms during a Q&A event at his Full Circle charity event, stating, quote, "I think, and maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like a lot of people went into the movies for going like, oh, it's the superhero romp, right? Let's have fun with it. And we gave them this sort of hardcore deconstructivist, heavily layered, experiential, modern, mythological superhero movie that you really need to pay attention to. That was not cool. That's not something anyone wanted to do." They're like, what? No, that's exhausting. End quote. Eventually, the full uncut version of the film that Snyder had originally intended was released on home video. The Ultimate Edition was released on Blu-ray on July 19th, 2016. That version was more coherent and gave a fuller realization of Snyder's goals. It's not fundamentally different in how it tackles the issues, but it maybe gives the film a better context for its events. Its release would not win over the film's detractors, but would receive a slightly better reception than the theatrical cut. This is the version I will be critiquing today. So with that context being laid out, what do I think of the film? Do I think the critics are right? Let's explore Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice. At the time I am making this video, the final film in the DCEU, James Wan's Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, has just been released. James Gunn and Peter Safran have taken over the DC Expanded Universe and are giving it a hard reboot. This makes looking back at this film strange in several ways. Knowing the inevitable failures that would arise from the series' ambitious plans makes the introductions of the DC superheroes have this weird feeling attached to them. When watching the special features on the Blu-ray, I saw how much effort they were putting into crafting a world that could rival the MCU. It feels strange watching this film knowing that it would lead to so many failures and disappointments, like rewatching one of your favorite team's playoff wins, knowing that next week they would be eliminated. It doesn't take away from what happened or what we got to experience, but it does strangely hang over the film. Most of the films that were teased in this film were ultimately released, but they never came close to dethroning the MCU, with the MCU serving as its own worst enemy. With that being said, however, the film doesn't need to serve as a vehicle for franchise expansion. Those moments within the narrative are the worst executed. We don't need them, and in retrospect, they only hamper the film, extending the film's runtime unnecessarily. I get that there are franchise demands and expectations you need to meet, but I just don't think the film incorporates those moments in a way that feels organic at all. Wonder Woman's introduction is awesome, but we don't get enough of her in the film. The introduction of Batman is essential, of course, with his narrative working alongside and then eventually dramatically merging with the continuation of Man of Steel's narrative. I love the way the film chooses to tackle its continuation. Like with Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, the consequences of the previous films have weight. This gives the audience an instant introduction into the traumatized mind of Bruce Wayne, as well as to the film's preoccupations with complicating Superman's journey. Bruce Wayne's psychological transformation from the two major traumas that informed his characterization at the beginning of the narrative, his parents' deaths and the destruction of Metropolis, towards a refining of his humanity through his connection with Superman, is done in a way that I find truly fulfilling. He finds his humanity again through his ability to recognize humanity in the ultimate outsider, Superman. He is reborn, away from the cruel and hard person he had become after fighting crime for 20 years, back to the original purpose of his mission. The Martha line is one that many people have a problem with, and maybe it is a tad silly if you're not immersed in the narrative, but in the context of this film, it makes a lot of sense. He doesn't choose to spare Superman simply because their mothers share the same name, but because he recognizes the situation he is in is that of his own parents' death, and how he had shifted from victim to perpetrator. He finds his way back to humanity, his connection to humanity being found with Superman's connection to the race that he was adopted by. This is one of the many moments throughout the film that are ridiculed by people who hate the film. In conversations that turn to this film in particular, the Martha moment gets ridiculed by many. To me, however, I was immersed in the narrative and found the moment to be dramatically effective. There are also major critiques of the film related to the fact that Batman kills his enemies. This again is explained by the narrative, but of course this is counting on the viewer to buy into and care about this narrative in a substantial way. I think a lot of people were turned off by the film's dour tone and its deconstruction of our beloved mythology surrounding Batman and Superman. As someone who is a huge Batman fan, but not as big of a Superman fan, I didn't have a problem with these changes. I'm always willing to give a film the benefit of the doubt when it wants to explore characters, even ones I love, in a new way. I think on a fundamental level, I just care less about authenticity to the original conceptions of characters or the stories they have gone on before. While not a straight adaptation of any particular comic, I think my views on adaptation fit within this context. As someone who is both a major fan of the Resident Evil video game series and a fan of Paul W.S. Anderson's live-action series, I can both appreciate the original game narratives and enjoy Anderson's radical departure from the original stories. I don't want to see the same thing over and over again. What's fun about each new film version of Batman is how the creators explore new elements of his character and world, how those changes juxtaposed against the pre-established elements we've come to expect based on previous films and the comics. For example, several people have a problem with Ben Affleck as Batman, but I think the casting is a stroke of genius. I think he is the perfect actor to establish Bruce Wayne's depressive persona in this film. His physicality is also well established in the film, with a bruiser-type body showcasing a different but interesting take on Batman's physique. Zack Snyder gets called things like a meathead director and things like that, but I came away from this film with the exact opposite opinion, believing that the complexity he attempted within the film caused the mainstream audiences to reject his style. He has read comics, believe it or not, and he seems to have a very solid grasp on what Batman and Superman mean on a deep cultural level, as well as a deeply personal level to him. Terrio and Snyder do a great job of bringing to life our world and then throwing in these gods and showing how we would react. I love the political thriller type narrative, and Jesse Eisenberg is severely underrated in this film. While his mannerisms brought to mind Heath Ledger or even Jim Carrey in Batman Forever to some, for the most part, I found his characterization of Lex Luthor to be very interesting. He was seemingly cast due to his portrayal of Mark Zuckerberg in The Social Network, with his characterization of Luthor fitting within a tech bro billionaire style, in the vein of a Zuckerberg or Elon Musk, with Luthor's man-child personality, obsessive tendencies, and manipulative practices, crafting a villain that, while not physically intimidating, is terrifying in an entirely different way. Terrifying due to his enormous power and wealth, granting his deranged mind access to the levers of power. He too, however, is given a sense of philosophical depth. His belief in the problem of evil informs his mission to take down Superman. He is also emblematic of the power that billionaires and the elites have in their ability to manipulate people into looking at others as a source of society's ills. It's a quite remarkably dense characterization that is reduced by critics into simply Eisenberg overacting. While I do have problems with the film, such as some of the action feeling weightless as a result of the heavy use of CGI, which in direct comparison with the Nolan films leaves a lot to be desired, I also discussed how I feel the film's attempts at expanding the DC universe mostly fall flat. However, I think that the film has a real sense of depth mixed with some beautiful visuals. Snyder's visual language is a welcome addition to the live-action Batman canon. I don't think this is a perfect film, but I think it's closer in quality to the Nolan films than people give it credit for. I understand why lots of others don't agree with me, and that's totally fine. However, I think Snyder does a good job balancing storytelling depth with interesting visual language, and I think in general, he is underrated. The film doesn't match The Dark Knight, but I'm not going to hold that against it. I find that the film works for me on its own terms, which is all that's needed.